thanks everybody who's here for joining us on what's our first webinar. Hopefully we won't come across any technical hitches, but forgive us if there are. But my fingers are crossed that we've done enough practice. So this is about Agile Architecture, something that Steve's going to explain. It's a new icon process, and it's kind of the culmination of what we learned about creating successful software. We've got a lot to go over, so I won't take your time too much. Mark at the end of the presentation is gonna do a quick Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to stick them in the chat, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steve, who's the CEO of New Icon, to kick off the presentation. Off you go, Steve.
Great, thanks, George. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is talking about Agile Architecture, which is our process about how we innovate, design, and plan complex digital projects and how we try to make them successful. Indeed. So, introduction, just go over what we'll cover. So who New Icon are, why complex projects fail, and what Agile Architecture is and process and our solution to it. And some takeaways that I kind of hope you'll get out of today is learning a bit more about our process, coming up with being able to identify perhaps where projects might be going wrong and how to potentially solve them, and some early warning signs, as well as get some tips and hopefully apply a process to projects in your company or in your organization, what you might be doing. Another thing as well is just like empowering to speak truthfully about it at various stages of the project and be able to call bullshit on things that's our bullshit. So who are New Icon? We're a design technology agency. We've been going for about 16 years, and we generally get involved with ambitious sort of IoT projects that span mobile, web, and cloud. We obviously design and have a great design department and build. So rapid prototyping, we get involved in digital transformation, and we also do workshops and things like that, all centered around the design and creation of technology and applications. So where do we typically come in on a project? So typically we get called in when a company or an individual has identified a problem that they'd like to solve, and they need help to solve it, and they need to understand the problem more. Or potentially there's an idea or an opportunity, something exciting around some new piece of technology or some new opportunity. And then the other is we get called in to rescue a project that's perhaps stalled, the team can't progress, or adding new features just makes everything collapse and is buggy, and we'll take that project and put in place some things to make it a success. So those are generally where we come in. So why do complex projects fail? So there's a stat, like lots of stats on the internet, but stats that says 70% of software projects fail. And there's a few reasons, I think, for this, but generally that's categorized as things going well over budget and well over the time frames. And some of the reasons for that is, in fact, having that fixed budget and that fixed time scale without really knowing the functionality, solving the wrong problem for the wrong person, and also false assumptions, which is throughout the project, a new assumption comes up that you hadn't considered, or an unknown that exists. But the most dangerous is actually the unknowns that are unknown. So the things you don't know that you don't even know, which are the most sort of risky to a project. So the cone of uncertainty. So this basically says that right at the beginning of a project, if you were to estimate something, typically your estimate is going to be off by a factor of 4 in the early stage. So it could be 4 times as much. And in software, you know, sometimes it can be even worse than that. So your estimate is going to be at least 4 plus or minus 4 times as big. And as you go down, as you start to know more about the project, you know how it works and what it looks like, that uncertainty rapidly shrinks until you can get more accurate. And certainly in design and with apps, the how does it work and how will it look can be quite similar, because obviously lots of the interfaces are the front end visuals like which people interact with, not necessarily the technology. So the how does it work and the what does it look like are quite synonymous in a way in lots of these projects. This brings us on to the iron triangle, which essentially says that you've got cost, time, and scope. You can fix 2, choose 2 that you want, because if you fix the time and you fix the cost, a new scope becomes available, you've got nowhere to move. And that means your quality, the only place you've got left to do is quality. If you're adding more things in the same time, the same budget, everyone has to work much harder, but also you have to sacrifice on the quality of that system. And what that does, it increases technical debt. Things, when you want to do new things, it can slow the project to a halt because new things introduce other problems and the application generally becomes unstable. So solving the wrong problem. So this is when you build an application, lots of the time people build it for the completely wrong thing. They don't understand the people, or they don't understand the customer and the user. They're not benefiting everyone in the value chain. So what that means, like you might have the fancy dashboard for the CEO, and he's got his numbers, or he thinks he's going to get his numbers. But what you've done is burden somebody else in the organization with loads more admin work. You haven't made their life easier. And that's obviously going to fail because the project is underpinned, needs that data in order to be successful. So it's really understanding and providing benefit to everyone in that value chain. And you haven't prioritized the removal of waste. So the other thing, it might be great that you've solved conceptually how you get that information into the system or how that works, but is it a burden for the user? No one wants to manage another username and password account, or no one wants to fill in your forms. Have you prioritized and assessed things from what's wasteful activity and what's value? False assumptions. So how do you discover what you don't know? So in the Lean Startup, they talk about building or designing just enough to learn something new. And so that's very critical early in a project because you want to make sure that you're doing enough in order to learn something new or to test something that you're not sure about. And you can do that a lot with design. So common mistakes that we typically see when we go into customers, or where we see people get stuck quite early on in the process, particularly in meetings. So, we arrive and they've had lots of meetings, but no progress is happening. There seems to be a general fear of getting things wrong. So they want to write things down, but at the same time, they're worried about, making the wrong decision early on. They're talking about technology. So everyone thinks we need to define the technology and what frameworks we're going to use and what databases and everything like this. Or they're talking about security, and that's impeding actually defining what they're trying to get done. There's, the other thing is focusing on MVP with no necessarily grand vision. So it's like, we just need to get something done really rapidly fast, but we don't really know where we're going. The jumping to written requirements. This is like before you've really got a prototype, before you've got an idea. This often comes because people are frustrated. They want to start writing things down, but you haven't actually explored the problem properly yet. So lots of those requirements are either going to be redundant or they're going to be wrong. Building for one, like I mentioned, building just for the one person or just for the one use case and not considering everyone, and focusing on the solution, not the problem. So they're focusing too much on the solution without exploring the problem, or trying to define things and lock them down before you've really understood what you're doing. So project methodologies to make things worse. If you look at, okay, great. So we know what we're doing, but how are we going to manage it? There's waterfall, there's Agile, and there's Scrum, there's Kanban, there's Scrumban, there's XP, there's Prince2, there's all these different frameworks about managing projects. And commercially, there's also particularly when you go into projects, people need to know how much this is going to cost. They need to know when it's going to be done by. So obviously in waterfall, you come up with your Gantt chart and you say, okay, it's definitely going to take this long. It's definitely going to cost this much money, which is great because people have that, they have a number. But the problem is it's probably wrong because we're very uncertain. We're trying to define things at this stage of the project where we know the least about them. And then you've got Agile, which is almost the extreme, where you say, well, let's just start and we'll see what happens. But obviously you don't necessarily know what the end budget is. But you try to break the problem down and say, well, we'll start delivering value, and we can stop at any time, but we don't really know how many sprints it's going to take or how long the place is going to take. So, and we still need this really to answer this question. So the two extremes are painful because we still really need to know when, cost, and we need some certainty around that. We need to know where to start the project. And that comes to sort of Agile Architecture, or that's a commercial introduction to Agile Architecture and what we do. So we call it Agile Architecture because it's like flexible rigidity. It tries to embrace flexibility whilst also putting some rigor and some structure, and also be very honest about when things are uncertain and when they're not, as opposed to pulling numbers out the sky. We give ROMs. And this is basically a result of us working on this process and tweaking it over 16 years of effort. So it's and it's how we approach all our projects these days. So essentially, in a nutshell, we've got Agile architecture, and it's if you look at a huge project overall, we would say, okay, we've split that down into an Agile architecture phase and a build phase. And what that means is we will essentially estimate for how long we think it's going to take to understand the problem and design that solution. So you can make the analogy, the reason why it's called architecture, it's like an analogy of the building. So, you don't start hiring your bricklayers to lay bricks, you actually get an architect to design the plans and so that everyone can experience what they're actually building before you start building it, and rapidly iterate in the design phase. Okay, and then the build stage. So early on, we will give a ROM and we will just say, well, we think it's between, based on our uncertainty, X and Y, because we still don't know. In order to know, we need to do this piece of work. We need to do this Agile architecture piece of work, which is like a discovery. Typically in our, when we've done this, we've noticed a pattern that generally, once we've completed that Agile architecture phase, the amount of development time is about 6 times the amount of design. So this is another good way we can test it. If we think, okay, it's going to take us, 4 weeks to design your solution, then we know it's probably going to take 6 times that to actually get it done. Yeah. So if it's 1 month design, then it's going to take 180 days to develop the project. So the overall structure of Agile architecture is essentially 4 sort of main phases, and this. One of the key things we do is we say we need to think big in order to start small. And so the first step is the explore, which is where we're really trying to understand the root of the problem. We do workshops and we really try to understand the problem. Then we do the create phase, which is a very rapid design phase to really highlight the overview of what we're building. And then we expand, and this is where we add we flesh out the concepts that that design overview is based on, and we deliver working concepts, which is quite important. So we're still delivering working concepts and proving those and fleshing out the detail. And then we refine, and this is where we chunk that up and we create essentially a product roadmap and a prototype per sprint. And so I'll just go through each of these sections in a bit more detail to give you some flavor of what we do. So discover opportunities through collaborative innovation. So explore. So essentially, this is where we go in and we begin to understand the problem. There's a few sections to this. We've got knowledge is power. We're going to talk a bit about innovation kit workshops. So we have a whole innovation kit around how we do these workshops and the structure to create that collaborative working with our clients and with the people we work with. Blue sky thinking, which is super important and sort of underpins the Agile architecture phase, and then the research and analysis that we take from that. So knowledge is power. So we want to understand the customer. We want to understand the business case. We want to understand the future plans, which is quite important. Even if that's not what we're going to build straight away, we need to understand those future plans, understand the project, and requirements in bracket here, because requirements are always dangerous because they're often wrong, especially for given requirements. That's always risky. Understanding users and personas, and particularly what the context and the desire of all the users are in the system, and understanding their requirements. And why do we do this? Well, really that understanding and this overview, which we do in the create phase, really creates the mission for the project, and it helps align all the teams. So innovation kit workshops. This is where we essentially run workshops which empower collaboration. They enable this blue sky thinking, and they create these creative mindsets and help people be creative so we can tease ideas and help understand the problem in more detail. So empower collaboration. This is where we essentially run sessions and exercises. So there's a great book, Game Storming and the Culture Code. These go through essentially processes to help people collaborate. And that's where you basically go through an agenda in a room and you workshop things together and help teams move on and decide and make progress, as well as collect ideas. Because in this stage, we're really collecting ideas. We're trying to understand problems. So we're really in that sort of divergent phase of the design process. And blue sky thinking, so this is the favorite part. The part I always like is where you ask everyone, okay, so in a perfect world, how would this work? And this is really to try and understand that big picture vision. It's to try and understand, well, in a perfect world, would this actually exist? Like sometimes, no, I don't want this to exist. It's a pain. I'd like it to be done for me. Well, that's an opportunity, and that tells you something, a potential to automate. The other thing this does is a bit like with a business plan. With a business plan, you might come up with your 5-year vision. It doesn't mean that that's what you're going to immediately head towards. You would then, but once you've got that 5-year vision, you can come up with this is what we're going to do year 1. This is what we're going to do year 2 to get there. And it just really helps align the team. So innovation and creation mindset. So this is work where we try to create like a safe environment or a playful environment and try to encourage creativity from not just from us, but from other people in the team. Typically, I talk about like open and closed mindsets, which is actually in a book by John Cleese called Creativity. And he talks about open mindset. You're being playful. You're trying to gather ideas from people. You're trying to go on tangents and explore things. The closed mindset is very much right. We're trying to get things done now. We need some dates. We need some deadlines. Let's start putting pen to paper. Now, depending on which mode you're in, those two modes can clash. If you're in an open mode and you keep introducing ideas and you keep coming up with tangents, you're going to upset the people that are trying to get stuff done. Now, also, if you're trying to get stuff done, someone's in that open mindset on the flip side, you're going to be you're going to feel constrained because that closed person is shutting you down, is poo-pooing the ideas or benching them, and because he's trying to move things forward. So it's really good just to say, well, which mindset are we in right now? Are we open or are we closed? And it just helps really align people. And so research analysis is another part of what we do in this phase, where we really observe. So it's very, and we do expert-led exercises where we observe. So, and we do a lot on intuition. So it's showing someone something, seeing how they can use it, or seeing how they behave, and observing, and basically using our intuition to understand that. And then interviews. So we'll hold interviews, and particularly a few frameworks and tips we use here. Jobs to be done, I think, it actually comes from sales, but it's really good for interviews, which is where you understand the motivation and the context and the desire of the user. So what are they trying to get done, the context, the environment they're in, and the actual desired outcome that they expect. And the context is really important. That can be things like, okay, it's the groundsman and they've got loads of work to do outside. They've been told they need to work on and get this thing done on a computer, but it's just a side thing. So, and they're not particularly experienced on computers. Well, that's going to have a massive impact on what you actually design and what you actually do in your project. And so understanding that from each person's perspective really helps, and it helps you uncover some of those golden nuggets that you might not uncover without using this framework. And the other thing is TED style questions. That's when you say, tell me, explain to me, describe to me. And when you ask, describe to me how that works, or explain to me why you need to do that, people tend to give much more detailed answers when you use those leading questions. And then whiteboarding, which is where we try to encourage people to get on the whiteboard and sketch things out and basically collaborate that way. A powerful thing I've always done is put that whiteboard pen in somebody else's hand and see. There'll be utter fear in some meetings. In some meetings, you dive straight in, start designing things, and everything's great. So outputs, what do we have as outputs from this? Well, we would have completed a number of innovation workshops for sure. We'd have a vision and a mission, hopefully, of the general project and where it's going, and all of our research, which is our collection of information and problems and things we're trying to solve. So once we've understood that, we dive straight into the create phase. And this is where we essentially do design sprints and we create clickable prototypes. And why do we do this? Well, we want to create like an overview, and this helps align users, customers, and it really helps create the mission. So the major part at this phase is we do like 20% of the design work that will represent 80% of the project. So if your project was a movie, then we would just be producing here the movie trailer. So we would show those core functions, that core journey that explains the whole product. So I don't know, if it was Airbnb, it might be, this is how you find a place to stay and book it. If it was Uber, it might be, okay, this is how you book a journey. You drop in, you say, I want a taxi, and you see it come. And you wouldn't necessarily build out how you do the billing, or how you put the information, or how you set up an account, or anything like that. And we do this and essentially this is a standard sprint. So how do we do it? We essentially do a workshop in the beginning where we agree, okay, well, this is what we think the overview of the project is and the core nuggets, if you like. We go away, do some design work, and then we'll have a prototype that we can test, which we test with everyone. We get that feedback. And then we do another iteration at least. So we usually like to do at least one iteration so that we have the chance for all of that feedback to come in. So selling sprints almost in multiples of 2 is quite good. The other important thing here is once you've got that overview, you've been able to do this pretty rapidly. And then it's quite important to make sure certainly C-suite people or directors and decision makers all have and experience that prototype early, so everyone goes, oh yes, that is definitely what we're building. Because it's very easy with vague definitions and top level things for everyone to have slightly different understanding. And then towards the end of the project, when they finally give it to the CEO or the decision maker, they say, I thought we were building this. And, you know, see, it really helps avoid those and basically align everyone in the team and all of the stakeholders in what we're actually gunning for and what we're trying to create. And yeah, so the output is a clickable prototype. And sometimes this can be wireframes demonstrating the concept, and sometimes it could be more high fidelity prototypes. Of course, at this stage, like I say, it's the movie trailer. We've really just done the tip of the iceberg. In terms of the whole system, the necessary screens are obviously that whole part of the iceberg lurking under the water. And so that leads us on to the expand phase. And this is where the devil's really in the detail. We want to refine and iterate on that prototype, and we want to flesh out all those concepts. So yes, great, we've got our core concept, but what's the foundations of that? How does that data get in? How do we get that list of information? You know, where does that magic button that suddenly does the AI magic come from? And how does that work? And so yes, the expand, we write the rest of the movie, and we want to gain feedback on the project so far. We're making amendments, we're adding, we're fleshing it out, we're designing the rest of the product. And, you know, during this phase, you can also identify new opportunities. Quite often when you start doing this, other departments go, oh, I've got something, or you start connecting the dots. And so that's really good. And also we want to get through and flesh out any unknowns or any risky areas of the project fast. And we're delivering working concepts here before they go to development. So proving concepts, why do we do it? So because proving concepts is faster in design than it is in code. And some people say, oh, that doesn't sound very agile, but agile is about delivering working things that work very rapidly. And so here we're just saying, well, we're still delivering working concepts that we can prove. And we work closely with development teams during this to make sure that that data flow makes sense whilst we expand that prototype. And how do we do this? Well, again, the same workshop sessions, testing sessions, and design sprints, just a lot more design sprints, but particularly for each feature. So we would break down, you know, you might have the settings area that might be critical, or the user sign up section, or the profile section, really trying not to leave any part of the system unturned and making sure that everything connects. And we get outputs, which is, again, much more mature release of the application where you can actually experience every aspect of it, and much more larger complete prototypes. Which leads us into the refine phase. So during this phase, we want to go through everything we've designed and essentially assess the feature value, which means, you know, is this value adding feature? Is this giving someone value, or is it painful? Is it wasteful? And we want to also see, by doing that, that allows us to start small. And we're able to say, well, what are the core things that we want to deliver early? And we also then can do a roadmap and start planning where we create a visual roadmap. And so, yeah, this is the need for the release plan, is essentially helping us define the minimum viable product, or the minimum marketable product. Because after the create stage is a great place where you can go out and get potentially investment. And now we're really trying to look at how we can put more detail on this. And we're aligning project deadlines. If there's other suppliers, we can come up with this sprint plan, and we get mutual agreement with everyone involved. Why? Well, we want to define testable deliveries. So the point of this phase is, which will be more obvious when we go to the next slide, if it's not already, but we essentially prioritize the high risk and the high value features, and then we define testable deliveries, which really helps when you go to development, because not only, which we'll come on to in a second. So how do we do this? Well, we go through feature value, and we look at estimates. So obviously we estimate all the features, we judge what things are scary, and we create a visual backlog. Okay. And this visual backlog, and then we restructure that into these outputs. which looks something like this. So release 1, you can see we'll have, okay, this is the prototype. You might just have 2 of the menu items that are fully working, and then release 2. Now, the difference here is we would have the big picture fully fleshed out prototype. We then make the effort to strip that down and say, well, what are we going to deliver in month 1? What are we going to deliver in month 2 and month 3? And we basically plan the backlog rather than leave it in a big list. We prefer to call it a wish list, but so we will plan that so everyone knows what to expect and what to test. Now that we still leave it up to change. So this will still work on a sprint base. So after release 1, people go away and test, and we can put the feedback into release 2. But if things change, we will update the prototype. And the reason for that is it's just much easier for everyone to understand by looking at a prototype what should be delivered than looking at a backlog. So when you look at a backlog, you might have a load of feature cards. Some are done, some are halfway percent. You say, well, what's the state of my software project? I don't know. Or I can see that this is done. Now, ideally, each card is mini and testable, but where's the overall goal and what we're aiming for? For people who aren't in the project very much and often make lots of decisions, having a prototype that represents that delivery is actually really powerful. So we'll say, okay, sprint 1, here's the prototype. We'll do the development and we'll deliver it. And then you can engage and check and test essentially whether that prototype matches the software delivery. And that leads us on to like rapid deployment. So during sprint 1, we will look at the end of the project and actually try to get it in a live environment as soon as possible. So that means that everyone involved, no matter where they are, can instantly test that software delivery. So we're rapidly trying to deliver working software that can be tested and verified against that prototype. And we're mentioning DigitalOcean here because we love DigitalOcean because it's so fast for us to rapidly do that and not worry about scalability. We're not going to do a 3 or 4 month project worrying about cloud scalability or creating some confusing and complex Kubernetes thing. We're just going to rapidly put that live and allow and scale the infrastructure over time as we add that to sprints. And DigitalOcean gives us the flexibility to do that with their managed databases and their droplets, which are just very quick and easy to set up. Okay, so that was the summary. So generally our Agile architecture, and it can be, it's a very exciting phase because we say, right, where do you want to be in the future? What's the perfect version of your application? Doesn't mean that that's necessarily what we're going to build, but it helps align everyone. And that's a playful experience and a fun one where we just collect all this information and we get excited. Then we do the movie trailer, which is the create. Again, at this stage, this is still very rapid, very fast. You get the point of the application. At this stage, often people can go out and get fundraisers and investors excited. And then we do the expand, where we really do the detailed work. You know, how does the billing section work? How do people create a profile? How do we get that data into the system? What does that look like? Is that going to burden this person too much? How do we make that fun? So we really explore, and as long as we're delivering working concepts, we're still adding value. And then refine, we chunk that then down into, well, what's the scariest part of this project, or what's the highest value? And we'll plan that, and we'll restructure and recreate the prototypes for sprint 1 and for sprint 2 and for sprint 3, so that everyone knows precisely what we're going to deliver and how it will work. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Yeah, open for questions if you have any. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That's our Agile architecture process.
Thanks, Steve. That was a great chat, breakneck speed, as always with Steve, and hopefully there's a lot of information there. So if anybody needs to go back and watch it, we are going to be recording it and we'll send it out to everybody afterwards. But yeah, thanks again, Steve. That was a great talk, and I'm going to hand over to Mark to answer any questions that we have in the comments. If anybody has any questions, please do feel free to stick them in the comments. Otherwise, I've got a few questions that I'm happy to ask Steve and Mark as well. So I'll give everybody a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions forthcoming from the audience here. Also, actually, one thing I'd like to add, just while people are having a think, is this webinar was actually in partnership with DigitalOcean. As you noticed, Steve mentioned DigitalOcean in the presentation there, so they've helped us put this together. So thanks to DigitalOcean for that. And yeah, I'll hand over to Mark. It looks like there's a question there in the comments, Mark.
There's one question from Alec John, just saying, thanks, Steve. Are your sprints typically 2 weeks, or does the duration vary? Our design sprints are actually 1 week, but we sell a minimum of 2 weeks initially, and then we can top up with additional iterations from there. They have 5 days each for our design sprints, but for development, we typically work to 20 days just because you need a bit longer to get things done. But it can vary. It depends on the complexity of the problem we're trying to solve. Certainly with development, that can vary. So yeah, but with design, we have 5-day iterations.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to go more than 20 days. That's the absolute maximum we'll go to. So we'll try to keep it, certainly in development as well, to 2-week sprints if we can. But yeah, it does depend on the project.
That's the questions at the moment. You had a couple, George, didn't you? You wanted to ask?
Yeah. So if anybody else has any more while I ask a couple, please feel free to still stick them in the comments there. One thing I was thinking of is just about costings and how costings, how does that relate to the Agile architecture? How do we do costings as part of the process for people if somebody wondering how much a job's going to cost during this process? Mark or Steve could answer this one.
Well, given I do the business development and the sales side, I'm probably best placed to answer this one, I guess. I mean, really, it breaks it down to, I mean, we've done big procurement processes before, and we're doing a big one for a grant application for Innovate UK. And that really doesn't suit our processes because everyone wants to know how much it's going to cost really early in the process. And as Steve's alluded to in his presentation, you just don't know until you do that discovery phase. So it very much, procurement in that way becomes very waterfall. And therefore, we can put all these Gantt together and all these costings together and try and break it down. But really, it's probably not worth the paper it's written on, because once you get into that first workshop, everything can go out the window and change. And that is the nature of software. However, what we would normally do in an ideal process would be we have a workshop, we have a meeting, we understand those top level requirements, and then we will give a rough order of magnitude. And to be honest, these days, it tends to come down to kind of small, medium, big, really big. And we'll say to a client, well, that might take 2 to 4 months. That project might take 3 to 6 months, 9 to 12, and so forth. And that will just give a client a range of, are you in the big, small, what pot do you fall into for your project? And then we can give them that rough order of magnitude for that and build project. But then we can get a bit more accurate on the costings for the architecture, because that's where we can do rapid iteration, as Steve's gone through in this presentation. And because we're only talking really high value piece of work, because it really brings it all to life, but we can do that in weeks, not months. So I think that's where we can say there is a leap of faith for a lot of clients that work with us of going through that initial design phase, but it is weeks, not months. And we can have, it's a smaller chunk of money and a smaller percentage. Obviously, we work in terms of the ratios of, if it's this much design work, and from experience, we feel this type of mobile app would take X amount of weeks, then we can work into, well, therefore, we think the development is going to be ratio-wise this amount of months to go and build it out. The other thing that I'll just add in quickly is that we grew up in the early days doing web projects. And when you think about websites, it really came down in the early days to how many templates were we building? If there's a homepage template and a service page and a product page, you can really start to understand how long it might take to build it. And because websites often are a bit more similar to one another, we could give more exact costings. But as we've grown up as a company, we're doing more complex projects, apps, IoT, back office systems. That doesn't work so well. But you get into a method of thinking of things like components. And the components can be a series of components that are responsive, can work on different applications. And we start to understand how long those components might take. And we say to the designers, well, don't let budget restrain you. Go for it and come up with however many components you want to be the perfect date picker, drop-down menu. If you need 3 types of searches, you can do that, create the optimal experience. But at the end of it, if the client has got a tight budget to work to, we can say, well, okay, can we take 20 components and turn it down into 5 components and still have a pretty good experience for the client, but it's a lot quicker for the developers to build out. And that's something we encourage the designers to do and work closely with the clients to find the right solution for their budget as well. We don't like to compromise, but sometimes we have to because money comes into play.
Yeah, sure. One more question's actually come through, Mark, while you were chatting, so I thought I'd just put this to both of you. was under the Q&A section actually, so I almost missed it, but somebody asked, how do you evaluate the value of features during the process? So I don't know which of you wants to take that one.
Steve, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you probably heard of like high-low, where you just do it's value. So when I say evaluate the value, it's in terms of, you know, what's the highest value just on a scale. There's no necessarily number system, but you'd say this is our highest value, lowest effort task, and therefore that's probably a great one to do. And then defining things in terms of waste. So that's possibly one for another presentation, which would be really good on lean engineering, because I'm a total lean engineering nerd. But like we would go through, we use some of those concepts. So like if it's a wasteful activity generally, then that's not adding value. So you basically say, like, if we look at what does value actually mean, it's any activity that brings you closer to value. So in the lean startup, he talks about defining value in terms of learning, because you don't have any customers yet. So how can you define value? So rather than defining value as benefit to customers, you define it as learning. And so whatever you can do to rapidly learn, which is what we do a lot of in the design phase, when you actually have a product or a customer, or certainly if you're building an internal tool, you've got a good idea of what the outcomes are, what the desired outcomes are. So you can estimate what that value is. So you can say, well, this is providing value. I mean, it's much easier to think of it in terms of manufacturing. Like if you're building an aircraft, every activity, every hole drilled, any activity that shapes that into that product into something that someone will buy is value adding. You know, picking up the drill, walking to that is a waste, because, you know, picking up the drill is not actually transforming the value that you sell. It's probably non-essential. It's non-essential. Sorry, it's waste, but it's essential. So it's like, you know, so you can't not do that. But lots of things, certainly in big systems, are wasteful but essential, because you have to fill out your profile, you have to put in your credit card details, but it's all painful, wasteful activities, and it's not really adding any value. It's not giving me insights or benefiting me anyway. So it's just quite a nice framework to use for getting a feel of, you know, which bits. And the customers often will tell you, know, what are the scariest bits, or what makes this project a success, and which is the killer feature that we're going to go with. You know, so that's I think that hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that was a great answer. And one more is coming. I think we've got time for one more question here. During when you're talking, Steve, it said, how much time? Yeah, how much time for the day? So how much time usually is the discovery phase? Does it take before you're able to quote the rest of the work? So maybe Steve or maybe Mark can answer that one.
Well, yeah, I guess we can always do estimates throughout. It just depends how confident we are. And that confidence depends on how much more time we think we've got to design. So if we've done 4 design sprints or 4 iterations, if we know there's still a lot to go, then we can get, there's no hard rules to that, I guess. It's like, have we discovered the core parts of this product? If we have, how much, then I find it easier to think, well, how much time would we need to actually complete the design work? And then use that times the ratio to get a rough estimate of the development time. But essentially, estimates are done with gut feels. And the other thing we do, I mean, estimation is another potential huge topic, isn't it? But in fact, if you read Agile Estimating and Planning, which is actually quite a good book, you talk about things like using relative measures. So you know, that's hard. And I'll give it 5 points, and this is twice as hard, so I'll give it 10 points, and you do it relatively. That's quite a good way of estimating, but also gut feel. And probably one of the most effective is bingo. And actually getting other people that aren't developers to estimate as well, because you're actually estimating on the complexity. You're not really estimating on the development time. So Ross, our designer, has done it quite a lot of times. You know, his estimates sometimes have been more accurate than our developers, because developers have this like knowledge bias. It's like, yeah, I've done that before. That's going to be really quick. But then maybe not the person doing that, or there's some other complexity they're not aware of. So we call it like estimation bingo, where you have all the features, you go through, you estimate them. We also create videos now, like explaining and walking it through, so it makes it a lot easier for people to estimate. So you've got the video of someone describing it, and then you can just do gut feel estimates through the whole thing. And then you turn your numbers off and give it to someone else and get them to do the same, and then you take the average. And then after all of that, if you just go, well, it took us, I don't know, 50 days to do the whole design process. Well, it usually works 6 times that tends to be near as damn it the actual development time for some reason. It's just a pattern that we've spotted, which might be, that is probably going to be different for depending on how detailed other people do with their designs, but that's just a general pattern that we've spotted over the last since we've been tracking it, really. So yeah,
great.
Of like, if it's an API that we need to connect to that we haven't worked with before, that's something that even with all the design and planning and scoping in the world, that how good's that documentation? It might be a big company like Salesforce, so you'd hope that it's been well documented, but often we work with smaller APIs for other people's data, and we get told, oh, it's great, we've written a great API, but you come to use it and it's not. So then we're running at risk as a company, and we can't always absorb that risk. So sometimes we'll say, with best intentions, we will say that it should take this amount of time, but we can't go into that part of the project. We may have certainty in 80% of the project, but 20% of it is we have to say to the client, it's kind of your commercial risk to a degree too here, because this is an unknown.
We have to know the risk, don't we? And like list it down. Like obviously, yeah. And then we generally quote things as if we're building everything from scratch. If someone's got an API and it takes you longer than building it from scratch, then it's a bit of a questionable APIs, and they should probably find another provider. I'd say.
Great. Yeah, makes sense to me.
I'm not sure I actually answered that question. How long does it usually take the discovery phase? Oh yeah, to estimate the rest of the work. Yeah, it's not how long a discovery phase is. Yeah.
It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to answer. There's no exact answer. But hopefully,
we try and wait until it's all finished before we go through it. But obviously, as we're designing it, we'll want to be keeping people up to date with. That's a big section. But the important point to hammer home is, even if we're not going to build this, and even if this gone way out of scope, it's still really useful for us to design it, because it's very fast and we don't have to build all of this, but it will be much more realistic in terms of your code, rather than starting and then saying, oh yeah, but you need this and you need this. And there's the whole 80-20 rule shows its head again, when it's like, well, 80% of the project costs come once you've delivered it. Now, I suppose if you deliver super early, then that's maybe okay, but it's just letting the customer know, there's probably, we'll still design it, but then we will chunk it down. So yes, it's a really exciting bell or whistle that we've done, but we will chunk that down and make sure we come up with something realistic that then can work with your budget, and just have that as a conversation.
Yeah. Oh. Perfect. Okay, well, yeah, I think that's us at time, really. So unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Steve or Mark.
No, I think it's Friday at like 5 o'clock, so we should probably just encourage people to go and get a beer or something, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks everybody again for joining us, and thanks to Steve and Mark for hosting and giving us the presentation. If you want to follow, if you want any more information, feel free to ask anything you want on social media. We're on LinkedIn. Often you can contact us on there, or you can follow any of the links that are on the presentation, which we're going to send around to everybody afterwards. Also, we have a podcast. We often will talk about things like this in our podcast. It's called Future Thinking. So if you search for Future Thinking from New Icon on any of your podcast channels, you can find that and follow us on there. We have a lot of interesting guests there too. So yeah, thanks again, everybody, and we'll be sending out the recording soon. And have a good weekend.
If anyone's got any other questions, then just fire them over to George and we can answer them offline.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Cheers, guys. Bye.